The last great human invention. What will it be? What I'd like to do is share with you a few methods you can use to predict and plan for the future. But first, let's get started with a question. And this comes from a course I teach in the Department of Engineering Management at Vanderbilt University. And it's the last question on the final exam. I ask students, what technology do you think will change the world as much in the next 25 years as computers and the internet have over the last 25? Now, I ask this as the last question because we spent the entire semester talking about future technologies. And by this point, I'm interested in what they think. I think they have insights that I don't have and could come up with a good answer. And I'd like to share with them what they think and what I've thought after having taught the course now for more than 10 years. Now, when we think about 25 years into the future, let's start by thinking 25 years into the past. So if it's the year 2020, we look back at 1995, and in this photograph, you can see this young man has a number of different electronic devices and things that you might recognize if you're age or at least older than 25. There's a video camera, there is an audio cassette recorder, there is a word processor, which is like an electronic typewriter, but not quite a computer. There's a small television, probably a CD-ROM player, lots of different devices. But all of those devices can fit into a standard cell phone, smartphone that you're probably carrying with you in your pocket right now. And in addition, it has other features that weren't even envisioned back in 1995, like global positioning systems. Or imagine it as a gaming system, or the ability to stream videos, television programs, and movies real time over something like Netflix. Now, if you think 25 years into the future, I'm asking about the year 2045. And what's kind of funny about this particular image, the movie Back to the Future, is I picked it because you'll recall when the film was released in 1985, they were talking about something that was going to happen 30 years into the future, into the year 2015. Remember the hoverboards? Jaws 19, I think was the name of the film. Flying cars, the DeLorean. A lot of those things didn't come true. And it's kind of funny to think about it, but if you think about what 30 years into the future might be, like the year 2050, like they were, could you tell us whether or not we're going to have flying cars or quantum computers or who knows what, virtual reality that's indistinguishable from real life? And so that's really the question. What technology will change the world as much in the next 25 years as computers and the internet have over the last 25? And there's a number of contenders. There's robots, and of course we have the two-legged and we have the four-legged variety. There are robots on wheels, autonomous automobiles, and companies like Tesla and others have vehicles that can drive themselves, pretty much constrained right now to limited situations. But in the near future, I would say in the next few years, pretty much in any situation you could find yourself in. Those vehicles could also be flying. Here's an example of Hyundai and Uber are partnering up on an electric vertical takeoff and landing taxi. And some of these taxis will be autonomous. There's also virtual and augmented reality. The idea that you could project yourself into an environment that's totally immersive with 3D video and 3D audio. Brain-computer interfaces. One example is Elon Musk's company called Neuralink. And they put tens of thousands, and ultimately it's going to be hundreds of thousands and potentially millions of little wires plugged into the cortex of your brain, and then be able to serve as a cognitive prosthetic for memory loss, provide vision for people who are blind or hearing for people who are deaf. Pretty remarkable technology. I mean, he talks also about the idea of being able to interface with your computer at a much more rapid pace. Instead of just typing away on a keyboard, you could think something and your computer would understand what that thought was. There's also synthetic biology. We used to call it genetic engineering, but the idea that you can slice and dice DNA, inserting sequences where you'd like them, taking ones out that are damaged, but it allows us to produce new types of foods and fuels and pharmaceuticals. Also, what you can do with genetic trait selection, being able to slice and dice DNA, is to potentially cure certain types of diseases. But once you're under the hood, maybe some people say, I want a kid who's a little bit taller. Maybe a child whose vision is a little bit better than normal, and maybe even improve IQ. Of course, there's a genetic component. There's a biological basis for intelligence. And if you can tweak some genes to increase intelligence, wouldn't that be a good thing? Obviously, some pretty significant ethical issues associated with that. And then there's reusable rockets. These rockets are actually landing, not taking off. And the benefit of reusable rockets is you can reduce significantly the cost to get payloads into orbit. And once you can do that cheaply, you can produce a satellite network like Elon Musk is doing with his company Starlink, where they're going to send up into low Earth orbit tens of thousands of satellites. And so instead of saying, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Because you're not close to a cell phone network of some kind, or you don't have Wi-Fi access, you'll have internet connectivity at super high speed, very low latency, anywhere on the planet. And although we might be in the Western world, in the United States, not so excited by that, it's like, big deal, I've got pretty good connection. For billions of other people on the planet that have no access to the internet, it's going to provide them access to information, communication, education. It's pretty remarkable technologies. When we have more microprocessors and more devices, you have something called the Internet of Things. So today we have lots of microprocessors. There's probably dozens in a car. There's certainly lots in a phone and in your television set and your microwave oven, or your refrigerator and your wristwatch. And when they can all communicate with each other and then they can provide information back and forth, more and more of your life can be automated. I remember one quote that said, "Civilization advances by extending the number of operations we can perform without thinking about them." I think there's more to civilization than just automation, but it certainly frees us up to do other kinds of things. So many people think the Internet of Things is going to change the world pretty dramatically. There's also something called blockchain, this idea of a distributed ledger. So instead of having to work through trusted intermediaries like banks to do financial transactions or to exchange currency, you could just do it directly. You could pay for things and have things purchased from you and transfer funds without having to work with anybody through this blockchain technology. And of course, that's the foundational technology for Bitcoin, the next, or what some people think is the next generation of currency. It goes beyond paper bills and coins made out of metal and even credit cards to do just purely electronic commerce. All of this needs to be powered somehow, and so green energy is a way to do it. We have wind, we have solar. Nuclear power is actually a very green energy. It's safer than most other technologies that we have for generating energy. Hydropower. So advancements are being made in all of these areas, and all of that is going to provide the energy necessary for a lot of these things that we're talking about. And then there's artificial intelligence. Now, what I have here is representative images from movies like 2001 Space Odyssey, remember HAL 9000, or Jarvis from Iron Man. And there's I can't remember the name of the operating system in the movie Her, but basically it's an intelligent operating system. And without spoiling the movie, the main character falls in love with his operating system. Kind of like falling in love with Siri, I guess. And then when you combine robots with artificial intelligence, you have some of the images that we see here. Now, when I was a kid growing up in the 1960s, there was a TV show called Lost in Space, and this is the robot. That was from 1967 or so. Then in 1977, Star Wars came out, and this is C-3PO, kind of a representation of artificial intelligence in a bipedal humanoid form. And then in 1987, another 10 years later, Star Trek Next Generation with Data came along. And then 30 years after that, Westworld, and this is Dolores. And you can see here in this image that each representation of the robots became increasingly more human as our ability to develop these types of robots has increased. And we could go on for a long time. There's a lot of things that I haven't talked about. 3D printing, asteroid mining, precision agriculture, regenerative medicine. There's just so many things, personalized medicine, that represent what's called the fourth industrial revolution. So I'll ask you, what do you think it is? What technology do you think will change the world as much in the next 25 years as computers and the internet have over the last 25? At the end of this video, I'll share with you what I think it is. But I'd like to talk to you next about ways that you could make that prediction with some confidence. 4 different methods for forecasting technology. Now, Peter Drucker, a pretty famous management consultant, in fact, he was sometimes called the founder of modern management, said, trying to predict the future is like trying to drive down a country road at night with no lights while looking out the back window. And I think he's not too far off, but I think there are ways, and I'm going to talk about them in just a few minutes, that we can do it a little bit better than that. So although I wouldn't drive down that country road very fast with my lights off, I think it can be done. So the 4 methods I'm going to talk about are monitoring, the Delphi method, trend extrapolation, and scenario development. We'll take them one at a time. The first is monitoring. William Gibson, a science fiction author, wrote, "The future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed." And so the idea is that technologies of the future don't just come out of the blue like lightning. They have to start somewhere. And it typically starts with scientific research that turns into prototypes, commercial products, and then widespread distribution. And so although maybe you don't become aware of a technology until it gets announced at some consumer electronics show and you read about it in Popular Mechanics or Popular Science magazine as some new technology, that technology had been in development for probably 10 to 15 years. And there's probably precursors to it before that. And so if you know to look for things, you can see the future. You just have to know where to look. And so the real challenge with monitoring, though, as you know, the internet is like drinking from a 4-inch fire hose. There's just so much information that you would have to sift through to try to find this information. And so that presents another challenge. It's like looking for a needle in the haystack. So in that course that I was talking to you about, Engineering Management 3300, Technology Forecasting and Assessment, in the unit on monitoring, my objective as a professor is to teach students how to look for information. So it doesn't feel like you're either looking for a needle in the haystack or drinking out of a 4-inch fire hose. And it really comes from the recognition that technology develops in a number of stages, right? At first, there's a scientific discovery. Somebody finds out some new principle of physics or chemistry or is able to create some sort of new material. And once they do that, of course, people being as creative as they are, they think about what could they do with that. And so they start thinking about how to use these new technologies, these new findings to create products that solve problems. And so they develop some laboratory prototypes and they get them working. And they might even work with outside partners during beta testing. But once they get all the kinks ironed out, they can actually, if they are funded well and have good business management skills, take that product into the market so that's now operational and available for commercial use. Some good technologies cross the chasm and become even more widely distributed, and they have widespread commercial use. And then technologies can then move into new areas that weren't anticipated by the original inventors. So think about something like laser. Lasers, when they were first developed, was just a source of light. But when you add increasingly more power to that and are able to focus them, and use certain wavelengths, it could be used in surgery, or it could be used in laser range finding, which is used in some autonomous vehicles to determine the distance from things, or in telecommunication satellites to communicate information across long distances. And then finally, there is somebody who writes a paper and talks about the social and economic impact of this technology, like lasers. Now, what's really important to understand as technology moves from basic science into everyday life through these various stages is that there's different sources of information associated with each stage. So, for instance, when there's scientific research being done, funding agencies like the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Education or medical organizations are funding research into stem cell therapies or genetic engineering or what we now call synthetic biology. And so when RFPs go out, requests for proposals, these scientific agencies, these funding agencies are asking people, oftentimes at universities and research laboratories, to send in proposals to do novel cutting-edge research in some area. And so That's where you can find out information about new technologies because people are willing to fund people to do research in that area. And then you can take a look at those research and development labs after they've received funding to see what they're producing. And sometimes they produce R&D lab white papers, things that are oftentimes concurrent with conference proceedings or peer-reviewed publications. And that's where you can look for information. A lot of times scientific research gets published or technological research gets published in conference proceedings because it's faster than going through the conventional peer-reviewed process. And so if somebody discovers something really exciting, they want to get it out to the world and drive a stake in the ground and say, this is what I found. And oftentimes conferences is a way to do that. There are competitions funded by all sorts of organizations. You may have heard of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects, don't know what the A stands for, I can't remember, organization. It's the Defense Department's funding of research. And there's the X Prizes. You may have heard of those as well. And there's X Prizes for rockets, for different types of electric aircraft, for autonomous robots. And so people at universities and even private individuals compete for large multi-million-dollar prizes to develop technologies. Academic journals, of course, is a great place to go. There are thousands of journals with millions of articles. And so that's where you could find a lot of interesting, new, cutting-edge research. And then when that research moves beyond just scientific findings into technological development, and then people start to think about commercialization, they start thinking about patents. And so the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office has a database, as does the European Patent Office and other patent offices around the world. And what's interesting is that patents are published, at least in the United States, 18 months after they've been filed, whether they're granted or not. And so a lot of times, because it takes longer than 18 months to bring a product to market, you can find out about products before they're announced by looking at the patents that were filed by the company years prior. And then finally, once that product does get out in the market, you can look at industry white papers, you can look at product data sheets, you can look at the standard media, and those are all sources of information. So the key concepts in monitoring are future technologies exist in some form today. The stage of technological development provides a clue about where to look for relevant information. And what you want to do is leverage others' research. And so there's smart people out there that are looking for interesting, cutting-edge technologies. Monitor those who monitor technology, and that can save you a lot of work. And then finally, monitoring forms the foundation for other forecasting methods. So once you've sort of figured out what you're interested in, and you've gathered as much information as you can about the state of the art and what's right on the cutting edge, then you move into the next steps in technology forecasting. The next one I'd like to talk about is called the Delphi method. And James Surowiecki, who's the author of a book called The Wisdom of Crowds, said, paradoxically, the best way for the group to be smart is for each person in it to think and act as independently as possible. And so the idea of a wisdom of crowds, the idea is that we'd like to get information from experts, right? Go ask somebody who already knows about the topic because they know a whole lot. But two heads are better than one. So let's ask a couple of experts. And then in order to save some time, why don't we bring them into a room? And now we've got 10 experts in the room, and then you've got a problem. You have something called groupthink, right? And so what Surowiecki found and what the Delphi is predicated upon is the idea that we can reduce the types of biases that are associated with groupthink by using a clever four-step method. So backing up just a bit, there is a need for expert opinion. Monitoring is an effective strategy for gathering information. It's how you develop expertise in an area. Experts are simply people who did it before you and spent longer doing it. Experts can answer your specific questions, and that's very handy. And multiple experts are even better. Group knowledge can be superior to individual knowledge. And notice how I said can be. What are the problems with expert opinion? Dan Ariely has a great book called Predictably Irrational, and in it he talks about different types of biases. One of the problems is who's an expert, right? Just because they have a PhD or just because they've done something for a long time doesn't mean they actually have what you and I might consider to be true expertise. Experts can be wrong, and they oftentimes are. And in fact, experts can disagree with themselves, and you don't know who to believe. One group says one thing, the other group says something different. Which expert am I supposed to agree with? Experts are human beings, and so they're biased, just like you and I, in all the ways that individuals are biased, and then groups of experts have even more biases. So this is the challenge of going to experts. But the RAND organization was up to that challenge. RAND stands for Research and Development. It's a think tank. And back in the early 1950s, they developed a method to collect information from experts. In fact, let them describe it. The Delphi method was devised in order to obtain the most reliable consensus of a group of experts by subjecting them to a series of questionnaires, in depth, interspersed with controlled opinion feedback. And what I'm going to do is describe each one of those elements, hopefully in a very straightforward fashion. Now, this work was done back in 1951, but it was top secret because the original research was done to try to figure out how many atomic bombs the Soviet Union had. So what they did is they found a bunch of experts on nuclear power and atomic weapons, and they asked them, taking the point of view of a Soviet strategic planner, how many atomic bombs would be required to reduce the output of U.S. munitions by 75%? Right? So they asked a bunch of experts that question. And in round one, they got answers that varied from as few as 50 all the way up to 5,000. That's a 100-to-1 ratio of difference of opinion. But through a series of rounds, which I'll describe in just a moment, they were able to reduce that and develop group consensus with a ratio of 2-to-1, which is a far better ultimate result and a more accurate estimate. So here's the 4-round process, and I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, so you can always pause the video and read to your heart's content. But there's a moderator, and the moderator doesn't have to be a subject matter expert. They're the person that identifies the theme, and they recruit the experts. Now, the experts identify events associated with the theme, like in what year will 30% of all new cars sold be fully electric? Now, I could do that as a Delphi survey, and I don't know that much about electric vehicles, but I know what I want to know about, and I know how to find experts in the area of electric vehicles. So I asked them, I'm interested in electric vehicles. Would you please come up with a series of questions that are associated with that theme? And they know what questions to ask. I consolidate all of those questions or all those events, and I send them out as a questionnaire. And then the experts forecast a date for each event. I get those forecasts back, and I run some statistics. I look at the mean, I look at the median, I look at the interquartile range, which is just to say what is the middle 50%, to identify who the outliers are, people at the very high end of the range or at the very low end of the range. And then I send those statistics out to the experts, and I ask them to revise their estimates based upon these statistics. And if they don't want to and they're an outlier, please justify your position. Now I get those new estimates and those justifications back. I run statistics on them again, and then I send those new statistics and those new justifications or explanations back out to the experts. They look at them and they can revise their estimates once again. And if they are still an outlier, they provide another justification. Once I get all that information back, I can continue through another round or two, but typically at this point, I've received enough, or I have enough convergence that I decide to publish my report. And so that's what the Delphi method is. It's a 4-step process to collect collective wisdom. What I'm trying to do is collect information from a panel of experts, reducing individual and group bias. I do that through the use of anonymous questionnaires. I use controlled feedback with statistical analysis, and then I iterate through multiple rounds. Now, this is a very basic description of the process. There are some refinements that can be made to tune it up just a little bit, but overall, this is one of the best ways we know of to collect information from groups of experts. Here's an interesting Delphi forecast on artificial intelligence, something that we talked about when we talked about the future of technology. And the conclusion of this report was, experts expect that between the year 2040 and 2050, high-level machine intelligence will be more likely than not. And by high-level machine intelligence, they mean computers that are as smart as humans. And really, that's what I think the last great human invention is. I think there will be a point where we develop computers that are as smart as human beings at pretty much anything humans can do. And so it seems a little outlandish to think that, but today, the cell phone in your pocket, that smartphone you carry around, has a calculator on it. And that calculator is a lot smarter than you are about doing math. And if you were to download a chess program, probably for free, it could beat you handily. In fact, it could beat any human being. And so there's a lot of things that computers can do better than humans. And we just keep expanding the number of things computers can do better than humans. Recognizing images, detecting cancer in X-rays or in MRIs, all kinds of things. And people are working on this ability to create algorithms that teach themselves. And so I believe, like these experts, that within 25 or 30 years, we're going to have computers that are as smart as humans. And what are we going to ask them to do? To develop the next generation of computers. And once they develop a computer that's smarter than itself, we're going to ask that new computer to come up with an even faster computer than itself. But we're also going to ask it to solve problems like cure cancer, or come up with a better telecommunications system, or a better rocket system, or any other kind of invention that we'd like. Because the computer will be smarter than we will be, and then we're going to be able to build lots of them, and then collectively they'll be even smarter. It's kind of a frightening thought as well, but I like to think of the upside of it as much as I do the concerns. Method number 3 is called trend extrapolation. Jim Barksdale, who's a former Netscape CEO, said, if we have data, let's go with that. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. Right? And so what we want to do is not rely upon an expert. If we can, let's move beyond Delphi and start to collect some data. And how do we do that? With trend extrapolation. Now, all of this came from this idea of what are called growth curves, one of the first examples of trend extrapolation, by looking at animal growth. Here's a cow stepped onto a scale, and we can measure its weight from birth all the way through several years old, and we can look at its growth. And here's what a typical growth curve looks like for a cow. And if we were to draw a best fit curve to work its way through all of those points, it would look something like this. And that could be a growth curve for similar cows. And so if I had a cow that was 50 weeks old, and I knew how much it weighed, and I knew it was a little bit above the curve, or a little bit below the curve, I could make a prediction that in 100 more weeks, it would weigh twice as much or 3 times as much. I could use this particular mathematical equation to make predictions about the future growth of any cow that you brought to me. And what's interesting is researchers have found a universal growth curve for lots of animals. Like this one represents pigs and shrews and shrimp and a hen and a heron and a crow and so on. It's dimensionless across time, so you look at each animal that has a different standard lifespan, like humans have a lifespan of 80 years. So 0 to 1 would represent 0 to 80 years, but maybe a dog lives for 10 years. So it would be 0 to 1 represents 0 to 10 years. And the same thing with its mass ratio, height to weight. And so what's interesting about this is you can plot how much an animal weighs over time. And if you do it on these dimensionless axes, you find that animals essentially grow according to the same equation. And so I'll bet we could throw another animal onto this chart and make some predictions. And that's sort of what's called forecasting by analogy. And so what we're looking for is not just curve fitting, but we're trying to understand the underlying mechanisms behind what we're observing here. That's a logarithmic increase. And we see logarithmic increases in all kinds of things beyond simply animal growth. Here's a Porsche Carrera, a very zippy car, and its acceleration curve through 6 gears. And so you can say how many seconds the car has been accelerating and how fast it's going. And I extrapolated from that just to see what would happen if we made a 7th gear. So I used a logarithmic function, put it through the points that I had, and my prediction would be you could get up to 250 miles an hour if your tires didn't, if the rubber tires didn't come off the wheels. It would take you about 60 seconds to accelerate to that speed in a 7th gear. Not a whole lot better than the 6th gear, so maybe that's why they didn't put it in there, or maybe their tires weren't up to the job. But this is what trend extrapolation is all about. fitting a curve like a logarithmic function through a bunch of points, and then extrapolating from there. But really, choosing the right curve is very, very important. Here's an exponential increase. F of x equals ab to the x, where b is some number greater than 1. And so we see something like cumulative global installed solar photovoltaic cells. That's a mouthful. But over time, and this graph shows us from the year 2000 to the year 2015, we've seen an exponential growth in the amount of energy produced by solar cells around the planet. Sometimes we see exponential decreases in things, like the price for silicon photovoltaic cells in dollars per watt. So maybe it doesn't surprise you to know that as the price of solar cells have declined exponentially, the amount of power produced by solar photovoltaic cells around the world has increased exponentially. And we see that a lot, exponential growth, exponential decline. It's kind of interesting to look at the relationships between those. There's also a curve called the logistic function. It's a very complicated equation. There's a variety of forms of these equations that all kind of describe a similar phenomena, which is easier just to call an S-shaped curve because this looks like the letter S. And we see this in a lot of different areas. One example, and I like this one, is propeller-driven aircraft speed. So way back in the early 1900s, the Wright brothers developed an aircraft, and it was really the first powered aircraft to take off from the ground and fly through the air. And so it was very slow, though, and it was made out of wood and fabric and had lots of wires. And as aircraft design improved, they got rid of those wires. They used wooden braces. They reduced the amount of drag. They moved from fabric to wood covering. That reduced the drag even more. They moved from wood to metal. It was even smoother. The engines got more powerful. And then finally, in the early stages of World War II, we had very, very fast propeller-driven aircraft like the P-51 Mustang or the Bearcat. But that's about as fast as propeller-driven aircraft ever get. In fact, if you look at the Reno Air Races, which is a very famous race for aircraft, the ones that win every year are essentially vintage World War II aircraft that have been cleaned up a bit. But that's as fast as they can get. So what causes it to be limited? See that dashed red line? Well, it turns out that as propeller-driven aircraft get going faster and faster, the propeller has to spin around faster and faster. And the tips of the propellers get going so fast that they get close to and exceed the speed of sound, which causes drag and a lot of vibration. And ultimately, that's the limiting factor. What allowed aircraft to get faster was getting rid of the propeller and then using jet-powered aircraft. And so they were able to break through that technological barrier. And like that graph I showed you just a few minutes ago that had a sort of representation of the growth curves for lots of different types of animals, this is the logistic curve for 17 different types of cases. This S-shaped curve is a phenomena seen in lots of different areas. And so if you know what the equation of that curve is, you know that the underlying phenomena indicates that you're going to have that sort of an asymptotic limit near the top. You go with an S-shaped curve. You plug in the different numbers that you know, the coefficients, and then you make a prediction and ultimately an extrapolation. And here's an example. Here's a sequence of S-shaped curves representing the amount of canals that were ever produced to move goods. So you have waterways and you have boats and you're moving goods around back in the 1800s, the early 1800s. But after canals were built, railroad technologies were developed, locomotives and ways of producing and laying down lots of track. And so railways were produced back in the late 1800s through to the early 1900s. But after a while, we decided to build the interstate highway system. And so lots of roads got built in the early 1900s to the years 2000, but pretty much we've built all the freeways we need. And so we're moving lots of goods around on the road. And then back in the mid-1900s, we started building lots of airports, got better at building aircraft, more that could fly faster and more efficiently. And we started moving goods around using airways. And what's interesting is that moving from canals to railways to roads to airways, it was essentially a 55-year gap between those. And so the question I like to ask is, what's next? Right? If you look at 55 years, there's something that should exist. Remember that quote? The future exists today. It's just not very evenly distributed or divided, or not very evenly. I can't even remember my own quote, but it's here today. And so what is that technology that's here today that's going to be the next thing? My prediction is SpaceX, yet another Elon Musk company, reusable rockets. In this particular case, he has something called the BFR, which stands for big rocket, and an adjective. And the interesting thing about it is this particular version of his reusable rocket has about the same number of passengers as a conventional jumbo jet. And it can take off, fly up and out of the atmosphere, suborbital, land at some other spot on the Earth, and it can always do it in less than 1 hour. Pick 2 spots on the globe that are opposite from each other, and that flight is less than an hour. In fact, most major city-to-city travel will be less than 30 minutes, right? So if you want to fly from London to Shanghai or London to New York, different distances like that would be 28 minutes, 29 minutes, maybe 32 minutes. And I think this is going to be, I think he's going to produce thousands of these rockets. And these rockets are going to be flying around the world. Hopefully they can get a ticket down to the price of somewhere between economy and business class and load up hundreds of people on these various rockets and then fly people from destinations. Wake up in the morning, grab lunch in Shanghai, and be back in time for dinner. So trend forecasting is based on this assumption that the future of some technology can be projected into the future, or technology can be projected into the future, and we can make estimates about where things are going to be. But sometimes those trends don't continue. Like if we'd made an estimate about aircraft, propeller-driven aircraft, just getting faster and faster and faster as an exponential function. Nope, it's actually an S-shaped curve. At some point, there is some limit. In this case, it was a physical limit. It had to do with breaking the speed of sound at the tips of the propellers. So it can be an issue of thermodynamics, it could be strength, it could be size, it could be frequency. Sometimes there's social factors that create an S-shaped curve, like maybe it's a fad and people's interest fades away. There could be resource constraints. And you see this a lot with growth. Like, let's say you have a petri dish full of yeast and you pour a little sugar on it. The number of yeast cells will grow exponentially until they run out of sugar. And there's no more growth medium, and it starts to taper off as an S-shaped curve, and essentially the die-off is an exponential decline. Or it could be legal restrictions or requirements regarding the possession or some action of some technology. All of these things can change the future trajectory of a trend. If our mathematical models become increasingly more complex and accurate, we actually call them models. So people can develop a model. For instance, here's a model for climate change, and you can make predictions about what the climate will be like in the future. You can also model pandemics, right? If you understand the mechanisms of transmission, about how many people have it, how easily it's transmissible, how people interact with each other. You make some assumptions, you plug it into a model, and then make projections about how many people will catch the disease and ultimately die of the disease. So that's modeling, which is very closely related to trend extrapolation. So what are the key concepts in trend extrapolation? Trends often continue into the future, but it's important to determine the underlying factors. It's not just about finding the best fit curve. If you give me a curve with 3 dots on it, I can draw a line through it, a straight line. I can draw an exponential function. I can draw a logarithmic function. I can plug it in and turn it into an S-shaped curve. It's important to understand what's happening with respect to the phenomenon that we're investigating to know which of those curves is the right one. And we spent a lot of time in the class talking about that. If you have an increasingly more sophisticated representation mathematically of the phenomena, you can turn it into a model. But it's very important to consider the external factors that alter trends. And those are typically human factors, things that have to do with the law or politics, ethical issues or social issues. And so that's why it's important to use the next forecasting method, called scenario development, to bring in those human factors. Seneca, thousands of years ago, said, "Whoever does not know how to take care of the future in the present will depend upon the uncertainties of that very future." And really, this is the purpose of this course that I teach and this presentation about predicting the future and planning for it. So the scenario development process really comes at the tail end of those first three forecasting methods: monitoring, the Delphi method, and trend extrapolation. We take all of that data and then we run it through a 5-stage process to develop some scenarios, pictures of the future to help us to understand what will happen. And let me go through the 5 steps very quickly. Step 1 is what's called a factor analysis. So I teach my students a mnemonic steeple, and it's a number of different macroeconomic factors: social, technological, economic, ecological, political, legal, ethical. You can even throw in competition in there. And you look at those different factors and you say, which of those factors are going to have some impact on the diffusion of the technology I'm interested in? Does it promote it? Does it inhibit it? What does that external factor do? And then how uncertain is it? Is it something that we know exactly what's going to happen in the future, or it could go one of 2 ways? So what we're looking for are 2 factors that are going to have a significant impact on the diffusion of the innovation of the technology it's very uncertain about which way it's going to go. Then we take those 2 factors and we create 4 scenarios. So imagine if one of the factors is technological in nature. Either the technology works really, really well, like self-driving cars, or kind of so-so. So it's kind of like either smart cruise control or it's fully autonomous driving. And maybe another factor that you think is important, impactful, is social factors. Either they're really, really accepted or they're kind of rejected by people. So when we have 2 factors with 2 different levels and we map them against each other on a 2x2 matrix, we end up with 4 possible futures. Technology is not very good, people don't accept it. Technology is really, really good, but people don't accept it. Or the technology is not so great, but people love it. Or the technology is great and people really like it. And you can imagine that creates 4 possible divergent futures. So what we do is we take one of those that we either think is most likely, or the one that our business is most afraid of, the one that's most dangerous to us, and then we do what's called a SWOT analysis. So you may have heard of this. You look at an organization's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So we take one of those scenarios and we do a SWOT analysis. Typically we do it in TOES order. So you talk about the threats and opportunities first, and then you talk about the weaknesses and strengths in the context of those threats and opportunities. And so you do a conventional SWOT analysis, and then you take the results of that and you do what's called a TOES analysis. I produce what's called a strategy matrix. So we evaluate the interactions of strengths and weaknesses with opportunities and threats. So if we have a strength and there's an opportunity, that's like our bread and butter business, right? If we have a strength, but it's an area that we view as a threat, then we need to keep an eye on whatever that threat is. But because we're strong, we don't have to worry about it too much. If there's an opportunity, but it's an area that we're weak, well, then if we just shore up that weakness by either investing more money, more training, more people, or acquire a company, we can take advantage of a new market. And finally, the most dangerous quadrant in the strategy matrix is where there's a threat and our organization is weak. That's where somebody can take us out. So what I ask students to do is for each one of these 4 quadrants of this strategy matrix is come up with a specific actionable recommendation about what you could do. And so with that strategy matrix, you take those items and produce a prioritized list of actionable recommendations. And what students come to realize is you start off at stage 1, which is the world is very uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen, right? And there's all these external factors, steeple, that could influence our organization. And it's all very scary. But if you go through this very transparent, very objective, analytic process, at the end of it, you can say, if this future scenario were to come to pass, and thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of our organization in the context of these threats and opportunities, here's the things we can do today to prepare for that future, to make sure that we're positioned perfectly. And that's the benefit of a scenario development process. Now, when students do it in the class, they can actually do it on a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And they need both sides of it, right? And so what you can see in the top left-hand corner of page 1 are the steeple factors, and they're rating each one in terms of how impactful it would be on the organization, how uncertain it would be. They take 2 of those factors, put it in the bottom left-hand corner, and do a SWOT analysis. Or actually, in that particular one, they create 4 possible futures. They name each future. They put in a couple of different bullet points that kind of describe what that future is like. Then they take one of those scenarios, and then they move up to the right-hand part of this picture right here, page 2 at the top, and that's where they do the SWOT analysis. After the SWOT analysis, they take that data, they turn it into a strategy matrix, and then from the strategy matrix, at the very bottom of the second page, you see 4 prioritized, specific, actionable recommendations. Of course, that's not what they turn in. What they do is they write that up in a nice, neat format, and this is their homework assignment for that particular method of forecasting. I think it looks pretty sharp. Now, some organizations, whether it's McKinsey or Deloitte or BCG or any other kind of large organization, can create short videos and vignettes to describe what that future is like for their prospective clients or partners. But also people use scenarios to create science fiction stories. That's what science fiction is. It's just some possible future. And really good science fiction authors think about the impact of new technologies and how external forces like social factors or legal issues or political issues can influence the diffusion of that technology and what impact it would have on us. And so science fiction is just an example of scenario development. Here are the key concepts from scenario development. Scenarios are stories about possible futures. They leverage information gathered using other forecasting methods. They're developed based on the interactions of uncertain external factors. The multi-step process is transparent, it's repeatable, and uses input from stakeholders. So you make sure that you get their buy-in every step along the way, so they buy into the conclusion. Scenario development, when done well, can lead to specific, actionable recommendations. And that's really the whole point of technology forecasting. I mean, it'd be great if we could predict the future and get it right, but really an important objective is to help decision makers to make better decisions than they would without your forecast. You want your forecast to have utility. You want them to be credible, and that way they're useful to decision makers. And the 4 processes that I've described to you are methods that you can use to create credible, useful forecasts. So I'd like to conclude with a quote by Walter Gretzky, who is best known as the father and first coach of Wayne Gretzky, a very famous hockey player. He said to his son, "Skate to where the puck is going, not to where it's been." And really that's one of the major purposes of the course that I teach in technology forecasting, is to help students to understand about where the future is going to be and what they can do today to prepare for it. Right? We don't want to educate our students on technologies that exist today with our blinders on. We want to think about 5, 10, 15 years in the future and allow them to project so they can reach their both their professional and personal goals. One of the things I'd like to also talk to you about, and this is a separate video, is the idea that it's not just about technologies that we can make predictions about, but if we understand what technologies will be developed, we understand what businesses will be created to bring those products to market. And then if we understand those types of businesses and what kind of products and technologies they're producing and services, then we understand the kind of workers they're going to need. And workers' skills should, again, inform what we do in education. And so there's a really great report called The Future of Skills. It is developed by researchers at Oxford Martin, Nesta, and some other organizations. And they looked at a number of future jobs. And for each one of those jobs, they looked at the skills that were required, and then they said, what is the most common and most important skill that people can have? And the number 1 skill is judgment and decision making. And that's why I created another course called Judgment and Analytical Reasoning. So if you're interested in knowing more about that subject, look for the YouTube video called How We Know It Isn't So. Thank you very much.